Before we can mount the Chevette rear axle and suspension to the frame, it is necessary to make a minor modification, enabling us to use our new rear shock absorbers. First, we turn the rear axle assembly over so the bottom of the spring recess is on top. Two rear lower shock mounting plates come with the assembly. These are identical and interchangeable from side to side. We locate the mounting plates on top of the spring recess and hold them flush against the lip of the spring pocket. Then we locate the holes with a center punch, or we could just as easily use a short burst of spray paint to mark the hole locations. Utilizing our electric drill, along with a 3/8 inch drill bit, two holes are drilled through the spring mount on each side. After the holes have been drilled, we take our new mounting plates and bolt the recommended shocks to each plate using 5/16 by 1 1/4 inch bolts with flat washers, lock washers, and nuts. We use grade 5 bolts, distinguished by 3 diagonal lines on the bolt head. In most cases, slightly larger bolts than those listed in the manual can be used without a problem. We slide the bolt through the shock and plate and secure them in place, tightening them with the appropriate tool. Installing the new shocks is easy, since the shock plates are pre-drilled. After the shocks have been secured to the mounting plates, we slide them through the bottom of each spring recess. We use 5/16 inch diameter by 1 1/4 inch long bolts with flat washers, lock washers, and nuts to secure the shock mounting plates to the axle assembly, passing the bolt heads through from inside of each spring recess. Once the nuts have been tightened, we return the unit to its upright position. The lower spring insulators are placed inside of each spring pocket along with the springs and the top insulators. Our rear axle assembly is now ready for installation. Normally, we paint all components with a high-quality gloss black enamel. For ease of visibility, we have left the parts in red primer. Later, we will paint them black. In addition, most original hardware has been painted a contrasting color for visual reference. Our new chassis, which arrived with a black finish, is now placed on 4 jack stands. We can now roll our complete rear axle under the rear of the frame. We have found that supporting the unit with our floor jack, placed under the differential, slightly elevating it off the floor, makes this task very easy. Once the rear axle is in the correct position, we lower our jack and then slide it forward, placing it under the axle extension. The extension is elevated so the bracket or brace at the front, just behind the companion flange, fits against the underside of the brackets that are part of our new frame. When the holes in the chassis mounts are aligned with the holes in the extension bracket, we install 2 3/8 diameter by 1 1/4 inch or 2 inch long bolts with flat washers, lock washers, and nuts. We use the appropriate tools to tighten them. Next, the control arms on each side of the rear axle assembly are placed between the frame brackets. The original factory bolts are inserted from the outside and the nuts are screwed into place. When necessary, we tap the end of the control arm with a hammer so it fits between the bracket. Later, we will use a torque wrench and tighten these bolts to the specifications listed in our service manual. Once again, we use our floor jack. Placing it under the differential at the center of the rear axle, we slowly elevate the entire rear end. Our goal is to guide the upper shock mounting studs through their holes in the center of each upper spring mount. At times, even with the shocks extended, we find we may need to place some weight on top of the frame at the rear to compress the springs. When the studs have passed through their respective mounting holes, to secure them in place we use the new hardware supplied with our shocks. The correct socket and ratchet are used to fully tighten the nuts. Now, since our rear axle assembly has been secured in place, we can slowly lower and remove our floor jack. At this point, the only thing left to do to complete the rear suspension is to attach the stabilizer bar to the bracket located on the driver's side of the frame. The bushing at the end of the stabilizer bar is arranged so its hole center lines up with the mounting holes in the bracket. When necessary, we tap the end into place. We use the original Chevette nut and bolt securing the stabilizer bar to the chassis. While holding the bolt with an open end or box wrench and using the appropriate socket and ratchet, we tighten the nut. We have now completed the installation of the complete rear axle and suspension system. Later, we will use a torque wrench to tighten the lower control arm bolts, upper shock mounting nuts, and rear stabilizer bar bolt to the correct specifications found in our factory service or shop manual. The entire front suspension, along with the cross member and rack and pinion steering, is the next component we will be attaching to our frame. Before this can be done, several small modifications are in order. First, we remove the motor mounts that are attached to the cross member. They will be relocated to brackets that are part of our new frame. A chisel and hammer are used to loosen each mount, and then they are simply unscrewed and saved for later use. We thoroughly inspect the condition of the rubber mounts. When necessary, we replace worn or deteriorating mounts with new ones available at our automotive supply store. Once the motor mounts are removed, it is necessary to remove the original brackets from the front cross member. Using a tape measure, we mark a line 1 inch above the lower cross member mounting hole. We draw a line around both sides of each motor mount bracket using a China marker or grease pencil. An electric saber saw or a hacksaw along with the appropriate blade is used to cut the upper portion off on each side of the front cross member. Previously, we inspected all front suspension and steering components along with the brakes and ball joints, replacing any worn or damaged parts. The entire assembly was then cleaned and painted. When the brackets have been removed, we use a file or grinder to clean up the cut area of the cross member, being careful not to leave any sharp edges. We discard the pieces that we've cut off. New front shock mounting brackets come as part of our MG-TD Replicar kit. We will now mount these to our Chevette front suspension. First, we turn the front cross member on its side so that the forward edge of the front side faces upward. This makes it easier to work on the piece. The original shocks must be replaced. Our new shocks will be bolted to these brackets. The new mounts are placed against the front of each lower control arm. Since the left and right mounts differ, we make sure that the open end of each mount faces toward the center of the cross member. Next, we measure 7 inches from the center of the lower control arm mounting bolts to the outside edge of each mount. When properly positioned, we mark the hole locations with a China marker. Our electric drill with a 5/16 inch bit is used to drill 2 holes through the front and rear of each lower control arm. Four 5/16 inch diameter by 1 1/4 inch long bolts are used to secure each front shock mount to the control arm. The appropriate tools are used to tighten the bolts. Having completed the modifications to the motor and shock mounts, we can now install the entire front end assembly. After placing our floor jack into position under the center of the cross member, we slowly elevate the entire assembly. It is very important to have all holes properly aligned. We refer to our instruction manual and review the mounting hole locations. The two inner crossmember mounting holes located at the front and back of the crossmember on both the driver and passenger's sides are aligned with the threaded holes in each crossmember mounting plate. We then carefully thread the original Chevette bolts into the holes. At times we find it necessary to gently persuade hole alignment by using a hammer. The fit is very tight and patience is required. We thread both the front and rear bolts into place on both sides of the frame. Next, we make certain that the bushing at the rear of each strut that comes from each lower control arm is placed between the frame mounting bracket. After we have verified that they are properly positioned, we insert the original bolts through the mount and strut. At times, it is necessary to tap the bolt through using a hammer. We do this carefully so the bolt threads are not damaged. Once the bolt is through, we thread on the Chevette nut. Finally, the through bolts that secure each side of the crossmember to the frame are installed and tightened. These bolts are located just below the cut we made to remove the motor mount brackets. The appropriate tools are used to tighten all bolts. In most cases, we find it necessary to slightly trim the lower front shock mount bushing to fit our new front shock mounts. We simply take the measurement between the lower plates of the new front shock mount and transfer this to our new shocks. After marking the shocks with a China marker and securing them properly in a bench vise, using a hacksaw we trim each side an equal amount.